You won't believe what happened 3 weeks ago in the mountains of western Montana. A search and rescue helicopter crew caught footage of something that shouldn't exist. The pilot still hasn't slept properly since it happened, and the 2 trackers who were with him can barely talk about it without their hands shaking. The whole thing started on a Tuesday morning when a 28-year-old hiker failed to return from what was supposed to be a simple overnight camping trip in the Bitterroot Range. His girlfriend had dropped him off at the trailhead on Sunday afternoon, and he was supposed to call her Monday evening when he reached the road on the other side of the mountain. When Tuesday morning came and went with no word, she contacted the local sheriff's office. The missing hiker had experience in the wilderness and was well equipped with proper gear, GPS, and emergency supplies. His planned route followed established trails through a section of forest that rangers knew well. Under normal circumstances, someone with his experience shouldn't have had trouble completing the hike in the allotted time. But the area where he vanished was known for its deep ravine systems and thick forest cover that could easily disorient even experienced outdoorsmen. By Tuesday afternoon, the sheriff had organized a ground search team, but the terrain made it nearly impossible to cover effectively on foot. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, broken up by steep gorges and rocky outcroppings that could hide a person completely. After the ground team spent hours without finding any trace of the missing hiker, the decision was made to bring in helicopter support. The pilot had been flying search and rescue operations for over 15 years and had seen just about everything the mountains could throw at him. He'd pulled injured climbers off cliff faces, located lost hunters in blizzards, and found hikers who had wandered miles off trail. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to witness. 2 experienced trackers had volunteered to join the search, both local men who knew the area better than most park rangers. They'd grown up hunting and tracking in these mountains and could read signs in the forest that others would miss completely. The pilot appreciated having them aboard because their knowledge of animal behavior and tracking skills often proved invaluable in locating missing persons. The helicopter lifted off just after noon on Tuesday, beginning a systematic search pattern over the area where the hiker was last known to be. The weather conditions were perfect for an aerial search. Clear skies, good visibility, and minimal wind. From 1,000 feet up, the pilot could see for miles across the forest canopy, looking for any signs of human activity or disturbance in the natural patterns below. For the first hour, they covered the established trail route and the immediate surrounding area. The pilot flew in careful grids, ensuring they didn't miss any section of forest where someone might be stranded or injured. The trackers scanned the ground with binoculars, looking for the bright colors of modern hiking gear that would stand out against the natural browns and greens of the forest floor. They found the hiker's campsite from the previous night relatively quickly. It was situated in a small clearing beside a creek exactly where his planned itinerary indicated it should be. From the air, everything looked normal. A properly set up tent, gear arranged in an orderly fashion, and no obvious signs of distress. But the hiker himself was nowhere to be seen. The pilot circled the campsite several times while the trackers studied the scene below. There was no indication of what direction the hiker might have gone after breaking camp that morning. The dense canopy made it impossible to see any trails or footprints from the helicopter, and the surrounding forest looked undisturbed from above. Moving beyond the campsite, they began searching in expanding circles, focusing on areas where someone might have wandered off the main trail. The trackers directed the pilot toward water sources and natural landmarks that might have attracted the hiker's attention. They checked gorges where someone could have fallen, clearings where an injured person might have tried to signal for help, and ridge lines that offered good visibility. 2 hours into the search, they were flying over a particularly remote section of forest when one of the trackers spotted something moving below. At first glance, it looked like a large grizzly walking through the trees. Grizzlies were common in this area, and seeing one wouldn't have been unusual, but something about the way it moved caught the tracker's attention, and he asked the pilot to circle back for another look. As they came around for a second pass, flying lower this time, all three men in the helicopter saw something that made no sense. The creature moving through the forest below was definitely not a grizzly. It was walking upright on two legs, moving with a purposeful stride through the thick undergrowth. Even from several hundred feet up, they could see that it was massive. Easily 8 or 9 feet tall with a powerfully built frame covered in dark brown fur. But what made their blood run cold was what the creature was carrying. Slung over its right shoulder was what unmistakably appeared to be a human body. The figure was limp and motionless, dressed in what looked like hiking clothes with a backpack still attached. Even from their altitude, the trackers could make out the bright orange color of a jacket that matched the description of what the missing hiker had been wearing. The pilot's first instinct was to radio their position to the ground teams, but the trackers urged him to follow the creature to see where it was headed. They needed to know if the hiker was still alive and what this thing planned to do with him. The creature was moving with surprising speed through terrain that would have been nearly impossible for a human to navigate, heading toward a series of rocky cliff walls on the far side of the forest. For the next 20 minutes, they tracked the creature from above as it made its way through the wilderness. The pilot had to fly carefully to avoid being detected while staying close enough to maintain visual contact through the thick canopy. Several times they nearly lost sight of it as it moved through particularly dense sections of forest. But the trackers' tracking experience helped them predict its likely path and relocated. The creature seemed to know exactly where it was going, following what appeared to be a well-traveled route through the forest. It moved with confidence across creeks, over fallen logs, and through areas of thick brush that would have stopped most people completely. The way it carried the body suggested incredible strength. It showed no signs of fatigue or difficulty despite the weight of a full-grown man and the challenging terrain. As they followed, the trackers began noticing other disturbing details through their binoculars. The forest floor along the creature's path showed signs of regular use: broken branches at unusual heights, compressed earth in areas that should have been undisturbed, and what looked like crude trail markers made from arranged stones and sticks. This thing had been using this route regularly. The creature eventually reached its destination at the base of a steep cliff wall. From above, they could see it disappear into what appeared to be a cave system carved into the rocky face. The entrance was partially hidden by overhanging vegetation, making it nearly invisible from ground level. But from their aerial vantage point, they could see that the cave entrance was much larger than it first appeared, easily big enough to accommodate the massive creature. The pilot circled the area several times, trying to get a better sense of the terrain and the cave system. The cliff walls were steep and rocky with very little vegetation except for some hardy shrubs and scattered trees growing in cracks between the stones. There were no established trails leading to this area, and it would have been nearly impossible for ground search teams to reach this location without specialized climbing equipment. After confirming the creature's location, the pilot faced a critical decision. Protocol dictated that he should immediately radio their findings to the ground search coordinators and wait for backup. But the trackers argued that time might be running out for the hiker. If he was still alive, every minute could be crucial. By the time ground teams reached this remote location, it might be too late. The debate in the helicopter was intense, but brief. The pilot was trained to prioritize safety and follow established procedures. Attempting a rescue in an unknown situation with an unidentified creature was not part of any manual he'd ever read. But the trackers pressed their case. They had experience with dangerous wildlife, they were armed, and most importantly, they might be the missing hiker's only chance for survival. The trackers pointed out that they had no idea what the creature's intentions were. It might be preparing to kill and eat the hiker, or it might have already done so. Every minute they spent waiting for backup could be the difference between life and death for the missing man. They also argued that approaching the situation with a large ground team might provoke the creature and put the hiker in even greater danger. Looking for a suitable landing spot near the cliff proved challenging. The terrain was rugged and heavily forested with very few clearings large enough to accommodate the helicopter. The pilot eventually located a small meadow about half a mile from where they'd seen the creature enter the cave. It was barely large enough for a safe landing, surrounded by tall trees that would make the approach tricky, but it was the best option available. As the pilot began his descent toward the meadow, his hands were shaking on the controls. In 15 years of search and rescue work, he had never encountered anything like this. Wild animals were unpredictable enough when cornered, but this creature was something else entirely. Its size and apparent intelligence made it potentially far more dangerous than any grizzly or mountain lion he'd dealt with before. The landing was rough but successful. The helicopter touched down in the center of the small clearing with barely 20 feet of clearance between the rotor blades and the surrounding trees. The pilot immediately began running through his post-landing checklist, but his mind was racing with doubts about what they were about to attempt. The trackers quickly gathered their equipment, rifles, ammunition, first aid supplies, rope, and radio equipment. They moved with the efficiency of men who had spent decades in the wilderness, but there was a tension in their movements that hadn't been there during routine hunting trips. They were preparing for something none of them had ever faced before. As they prepared to leave the helicopter, the pilot made it clear that he planned to stay with the aircraft. Standard procedure called for the pilot to remain with the helicopter during ground operations, and he had no training for tracking dangerous wildlife through the forest. His job was to maintain radio contact with base operations and be ready for immediate evacuation if needed. But the trackers had other ideas. They argued that they needed all the help they could get for what they were about to face. This wasn't a normal search and rescue operation, and normal procedures didn't apply. The creature they'd seen was larger and potentially more dangerous than anything they'd encountered before, and they couldn't afford to split their small team. The pilot resisted at first, explaining that leaving the helicopter unattended violated multiple safety protocols. But the trackers pressed their case with increasing urgency. They pointed out that the creature had demonstrated intelligence in its movements through the forest and its choice of shelter. They might need every advantage they could get to outthink and outmaneuver it. More importantly, they argued time was running out for the hiker. The longer they debated, the less likely it became that they would find him alive. If the creature had taken him as prey, it might already be too late. But if there was any chance the hiker was still breathing, they needed to act immediately. The pilot's fear was evident, but so was his sense of duty to the missing hiker. After several minutes of heated discussion, he made the decision that would haunt him for weeks afterward. He would accompany the trackers to the cave, but only after disabling the helicopter's engine to prevent theft and hiding the keys in a location known only to him. The half-mile trek from the landing site to the cliff wall took nearly an hour. The terrain was much more difficult to navigate on foot than it had appeared from the air. They had to work their way through thick undergrowth, across rocky creeks, and around massive fallen trees that blocked their path. The trackers took the lead, using their tracking skills to find the easiest route through the wilderness. About halfway to their destination, they picked up the creature's trail. The signs were unmistakable, footprints in soft earth that were nearly 18 inches long and pressed deep into the ground. The depth of the impressions suggested incredible weight, far more than any known animal in the region. The footprints showed a humanoid shape with distinct toe marks, but the size was beyond anything in the scientific literature. Following the trail revealed other disturbing evidence of the creature's presence. Branches were broken at heights of 8 to 10 feet, far above where any normal animal would have caused damage. The breaks appeared to be deliberate rather than accidental, as if the creature had been marking its territory or clearing a path for easier travel. They found scratch marks on tree trunks that were unlike anything the trackers had seen before. The marks were too high and too deep to have been made by grizzlies or other known predators. Some of the scratches appeared fresh, while others looked old and weathered, suggesting the creature had been using this area for an extended period. The smell was the next thing they noticed. A strong, musky odor permeated the area around the creature's trail, unlike any animal scent the trackers were familiar with. It was organic but alien, with an intensity that suggested the creature had a powerful natural musk for marking territory or communicating with others of its kind. As they got closer to the cliff wall, they began finding more elaborate signs of the creature's presence. Crude structures made from arranged branches and stones appeared along the trail, too organized to be natural formations, but too primitive to be human construction. Some appear to be markers, while others might have served as shelters or storage areas. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of bones scattered in a small clearing about 100 yards from the cave entrance. Most were clearly from elk and other forest animals, picked clean and arranged in neat piles. But mixed among them were items that made the men's blood run cold. Fragments of clothing, a hiking boot, and what appeared to be human bone fragments weathered by time and exposure. The trackers exchanged grim looks as they examined the bone pile. This wasn't the first person the creature had taken. The evidence suggested it had been hunting humans in this area for some time, possibly years. The missing hiker they were trying to rescue might already be dead, and they might be walking into a trap. But they pressed on toward the cave, moving more cautiously now that they understood the full scope of what they were dealing with. The creature wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct. It was an intelligent predator with established hunting patterns and a proven track record of killing humans. The cave entrance was larger than it had appeared from the helicopter, with an opening nearly 10 feet high and 15 feet wide carved into the cliff wall. The entrance was partially concealed by hanging vegetation and strategically placed rocks, making it nearly invisible from most ground-level approaches. Only someone specifically looking for it would have been likely to find it. Fresh drag marks in the dirt led directly into the cave, along with the creature's massive footprints. The tracks were so recent that some of the disturbed earth was still settling. Whatever the creature had done with the hiker, it had happened within the last few hours. The smell from inside the cave was overwhelming, a mixture of the creature's musk, decay, and something else they couldn't identify. The trackers covered their noses and mouths with cloth, but the stench was so powerful it made their eyes water. Whatever was living in this cave had been there for a long time. They could hear sounds coming from deep within the cave system, scraping noises, heavy footsteps, and what sounded almost like primitive vocalizations. The creature was definitely inside, and it appeared to be active. The sounds echoed off the cave walls, making it difficult to determine exactly how far back the tunnel system extended. The pilot hung back at the cave entrance while the trackers prepared to venture inside. His fear was paralyzing. Everything about this situation violated his training and common sense. But the trackers reminded him that the missing hiker's life depended on their actions. In the next few minutes, one of the trackers volunteered to scout ahead, while the others maintained their position near the entrance. He moved carefully into the cave, using a small flashlight to illuminate the path ahead. The tunnel sloped downward and curved to the right, disappearing into darkness beyond the range of his light. The scout returned after just a few minutes, his face pale with fear and excitement. He'd found evidence of human presence deeper in the cave: scattered camping equipment, torn clothing, and what looked like a makeshift prison area created by piling rocks to block off a small side chamber. More importantly, he'd heard a human voice calling weakly for help from somewhere deeper in the cave system. The missing hiker was alive, but his voice sounded weak and distressed. There was no time to waste on further planning or waiting for backup. They had to act immediately. The sounds of the creature's movement were getting closer to the cave entrance. It seemed to be aware of their presence and was investigating the disturbance. The trackers could hear its heavy footsteps and guttural breathing echoing through the tunnels. Whatever they were going to do, they had to do it quickly. The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. They would create a distraction to draw the creature away from the area where the hiker was being held, allowing one person to slip past and attempt a rescue. It was risky and relied on splitting their already small team, but it was the only option that gave the hiker a chance of survival. The trackers positioned themselves on opposite sides of the cave entrance, using the natural rock formations as cover. The pilot, despite his fear, agreed to help create noise and confusion by using rocks to bang on the cliff walls. The goal was to make the creature think they were a larger group attacking from multiple directions. When they began their distraction, the response from inside the cave was immediate and terrifying. A roar echoed from the depths that was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. Deeper and more powerful than a grizzly, but with an intelligence and fury that was purely human, the creature was angry, and it was coming to investigate. Heavy footsteps pounded through the cave system, getting closer to the entrance with each passing second. The trackers could see a massive shadow moving in the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. When the creature finally appeared at the cave mouth, all three men froze in terror. The creature was even larger than it had appeared from the helicopter. Standing upright, it was easily 9 feet tall with shoulders that were nearly 4 feet wide. Its entire body was covered in thick, dark brown fur, except for its face, hands, and feet, which showed leathery, dark skin underneath. Its arms were disproportionately long, reaching nearly to its knees when it stood erect. But it was the creature's face that was most disturbing. While clearly not human, it showed an intelligence and awareness that was unmistakably humanoid. Its eyes were dark and calculating, studying the three men with what appeared to be tactical assessment rather than simple animal aggression. This thing was thinking, planning, and evaluating the threat they represented. The creature didn't charge immediately as they had expected. Instead, it positioned itself defensively at the cave entrance, blocking their access while studying their positions and weapons. It made low, rumbling vocalizations that sounded almost like attempts at communication, though in no language any of them recognized. What struck all three men was how methodically the creature assessed the situation. Its dark eyes moved from one tracker to the other, taking note of their weapons, their positioning, and their body language. When one of the trackers shifted his rifle slightly, the creature's attention immediately focused on the movement. This wasn't the behavior of a mindless beast. It was evaluating threats and planning its response. The creature's posture was defensive rather than aggressive. It stood with its massive arms partially extended, creating a barrier between the men and the cave entrance. But it didn't advance or make threatening gestures. Its breathing was controlled and steady, not the rapid panting of an animal in panic or rage. Everything about its demeanor suggested intelligence and restraint. The standoff continued for several tense minutes that felt like hours. The trackers kept their rifles trained on the creature, but hesitated to fire. Despite its obvious physical threat, there was something about its behavior that suggested it might be capable of reasoning. It wasn't attacking blindly, but seemed to be trying to understand their intentions and communicate its own. The creature began making different sounds, clicks, and grunts that varied in pitch and rhythm. At first, the men thought it might be calling to others of its kind, but gradually, they realized the sounds were directed at them. The creature was trying to communicate using a complex system of vocalizations that suggested language rather than simple animal noises. When the pilot accidentally kicked a small stone, causing it to clatter across the rocky ground, the creature immediately turned toward the sound. But instead of aggressive reaction, it tilted its head in what appeared to be curiosity. It made a series of soft clicking sounds and gestured toward the stone with one massive hand, as if asking what had caused the noise. From deeper in the cave, they could hear the weak voice of the missing hiker calling for help. The sound seemed to agitate the creature, which turned toward the voice and made what sounded like warning calls. But the tone wasn't threatening. It sounded more like a parent trying to calm a frightened child. The creature looked back at the three men and made gestures toward the cave, as if trying to explain something about the person inside. The behavior was puzzling and contradicted everything they had expected. Rather than aggressive, the creature seemed protective, almost as if it was guarding the hiker rather than preparing to harm him. When the hiker's voice grew weaker, the creature showed what could only be described as concern, shifting its weight from foot to foot and making soft, worried sounds. One of the trackers tried an experiment. He slowly lowered his rifle and took a step backward away from the cave entrance. The creature's response was immediate, but not violent. It relaxed its defensive posture slightly and made what sounded like approving noises. When the tracker raised his rifle again, the creature tensed and resumed its guarding position. It was clearly responding to their threat level and adjusting its behavior accordingly. The pilot, despite his fear, began to recognize patterns in the creature's vocalizations. Certain sounds seemed to be associated with specific gestures or situations. When the creature gestured toward the cave and made low, gentle sounds, it seemed to be trying to reassure them about something. When it heard the hiker's voice and responded with clicking sounds, it appeared to be communicating with the person inside. This realization changed the dynamics of the confrontation entirely. The creature wasn't holding the hiker prisoner in the traditional sense, it was protecting him. But from what? And why wouldn't it allow them to help? The answers to these questions would have to wait because time was running out for the injured man inside the cave. During a brief lull in the standoff, when the creature turned slightly to respond to another call from the hiker, one of the trackers managed to slip around the side of the cave entrance. He moved with the stealth that came from decades of hunting experience, using the natural rock formations and shadows to conceal his movement. The creature's attention was focused on his companions, and it didn't notice the flanking maneuver. Moving carefully through the shadows, the tracker worked his way into the cave system using a route the creature couldn't see from its position. The entrance he found was narrow and partially concealed, probably a secondary opening that the creature used for ventilation or as an escape route. It required him to squeeze through a gap between two large rocks, but it provided access to the cave system without alerting the guardian at the main entrance. The rescue attempt was harrowing. The tracker had to navigate through a maze of tunnels and chambers following the sound of the hiker's voice while trying to avoid detection by the creature. The cave system was much more extensive than they had realized, with multiple levels and branches that could have hidden dozens of people. The secondary entrance led into a narrow passage that sloped downward at a steep angle. The tracker had to use his flashlight sparingly to avoid creating light that might alert the creature to his presence. The walls were smooth rock worn by years of water flow, and the floor was covered with a layer of soft earth that muffled his footsteps. As he moved deeper into the cave system, he began to understand the sophistication of the creature's domain. The tunnels weren't random formations, but appear to have been deliberately modified and improved. Loose rocks had been cleared from the pathways, and natural shelves in the rock walls had been organized with what looked like stored supplies, roots, berries, and other food items carefully arranged and preserved. The air in the caves was surprisingly fresh, suggesting a complex ventilation system that drew air from multiple surface openings. The temperature was constant and comfortable, making the cave system an ideal shelter from the harsh mountain weather. It was clear that the creature had been living here for a long time and had made significant improvements to make it suitable for long-term habitation. He found evidence of the creature's intelligence everywhere he looked. Tool marks on the walls showed where passages had been widened or smoothed. Primitive but effective drainage systems had been carved into the floors to channel water away from living areas. Even more sophisticated was a series of reflecting surfaces made from polished metal objects, probably lost or stolen items from campers that had been positioned to redirect light from the entrance deeper into the cave system. The hunter also discovered that the creature wasn't alone in the caves. Signs of other inhabitants were everywhere: smaller footprints, different sleeping areas, and evidence of a complex social structure. Some of the footprints were much smaller, suggesting young creatures, while others showed variations in size and gait that indicated multiple adults. This wasn't a solitary monster, but a family group with an organized society. Following the sound of the hiker's voice led him through several chambers that had clearly been designated for specific purposes. One area appeared to be used for food preparation with stone tools arranged on flat rock surfaces and evidence of controlled fires. Another chamber contained what looked like sleeping areas with beds made from gathered vegetation and animal furs arranged in neat rows. Most disturbing was a chamber that appeared to be dedicated to human artifacts. Backpacks, clothing, camping equipment, and personal items were carefully arranged and sorted. Some items showed signs of age and weathering, suggesting they had been collected over many years. But rather than being destroyed or scattered, everything was organized and preserved, almost like a museum collection. The hunter finally found the missing hiker in a small chamber that had been partially sealed off with rocks and debris, but not in the way they had originally thought. The barrier wasn't designed to keep the hiker prisoner, but to protect him from the deeper parts of the cave system. It was more like a hospital room than a prison cell, with soft bedding made from gathered materials and easy access to water from a small underground stream. The hiker was conscious but badly injured. Dehydrated despite having access to water with what appeared to be a broken leg and numerous cuts and bruises that showed signs of careful tending. Someone had cleaned and dressed his wounds using primitive but effective techniques and had been providing him with regular food and water to keep him alive. The hiker's story was even more bizarre than what they had witnessed. According to him, he had fallen into a ravine while trying to take a photograph and had injured his leg in the fall. Unable to climb out and with his cell phone damaged in the fall, he had resigned himself to waiting for rescue or death. But instead of dying, he had been found by the creature. Rather than attacking him, it had carefully lifted him out of the ravine and carried him to the cave. For the past 2 days, it had been bringing him water and food, mostly berries and roots, but enough to keep him alive. The hiker insisted that the creature had shown no intention of harming him. While it had prevented him from leaving the cave, it had also tended to his injuries as best it could, and had protected him from other predators in the forest. The makeshift prison he was being held in was more like a shelter designed to keep him safe while his injuries healed. This revelation changed everything about the rescue operation. The creature wasn't a mindless predator, but an intelligent being that had been trying to help the injured hiker in the only way it knew how. The bone pile they had found outside might have been from natural deaths or other predators, not evidence of the creature's hunting activities. But regardless of its intentions, they still needed to get the hiker to proper medical care. His injuries required treatment that the creature couldn't provide, and his family needed to know he was alive. The rescue had to continue, even if it meant betraying a creature that had been trying to help. Getting the injured hiker out of the cave proved to be the most dangerous part of the entire operation. He couldn't walk on his injured leg, so the hunter had to carry him through the narrow tunnels while trying to remain silent. Every step risked alerting the creature to their presence and potentially triggering a violent reaction. The journey back through the cave system was a nightmare of careful navigation and suppressed panic. The hunter had to retrace his route through passages that seemed much narrower when carrying another person. Several times they had to stop and rest when the injured hiker's pain became too intense, risking discovery with each delay. The most terrifying moments came when they heard the creature moving through the main tunnels nearby. Its heavy footsteps would echo through the rock passages, sometimes coming close enough that they could hear its breathing and low vocalizations. During these encounters, they would freeze in whatever position they were in, barely daring to breathe until the sounds moved away. At one point, they became completely lost in the maze of passages. The hunter had been so focused on avoiding detection that he had missed a crucial turn and led them into an unfamiliar section of the cave system. With the injured hiker growing weaker and their situation becoming increasingly desperate, they had to risk using the flashlight more frequently to find their way back to the correct route. The escape became even more complicated when they triggered what appeared to be some kind of primitive alarm system. The creature had arranged loose rocks in certain passages that would clatter and fall if disturbed. When the hunter accidentally kicked one of these warning systems, the sound echoed through the caves like a gunshot, immediately alerting the creature to their presence. The response was immediate and terrifying. They could hear the creature roaring with what sounded like rage and betrayal, its heavy footsteps pounding through the main tunnels as it searched for the intruders. The sound was so close and so powerful that rock dust began falling from the ceiling, and they could feel the vibrations through the cave floor. Meanwhile, his companions at the cave entrance were running out of ways to keep the creature distracted. They could hear the commotion from inside the caves and knew that the rescue attempt had been discovered. The creature was no longer focused on them, but was moving deeper into the cave system to investigate the disturbance. Time was running out before it discovered the rescue in progress. The two remaining hunters had to make a split-second decision about whether to enter the caves to help their companion or maintain their position at the entrance. The pilot, despite his terror, volunteered to create additional noise and distraction by throwing rocks and shouting, giving the hunters the opportunity to provide backup if needed. As the creature moved deeper into the caves, its vocalizations changed from the earlier attempts at communication to sounds of pure fury. The intelligence was still there, but now it was focused on tracking down whoever had invaded its domain and threatened its protected charge. The trackers outside could hear it systematically searching the cave system, getting closer to the rescue attempt with each passing minute. The extraction took nearly 30 minutes of careful movement through the cave system, with each minute feeling like an hour. The tracker, carrying the injured hiker, had to rest frequently, and several times they had to hide inside chambers when they heard the creature moving nearby. The injured man remained conscious throughout the ordeal, but was clearly in severe pain from being moved, occasionally letting out small sounds of distress that they feared might give away their position. The most harrowing moment came when they were nearly at the secondary entrance and could see natural light filtering in from outside. They heard the creature approaching their hiding spot, its breathing heavy and angry as it searched for them. They pressed themselves against the cave wall in a narrow crevice, barely breathing as the massive shadow passed by their hiding place. The creature paused just feet away from where they were hidden, and they could hear it sniffing the air, trying to detect their scent. Its breathing was controlled but intense, and they could hear small sounds as it examined the passage where they had passed. For several eternal minutes, they were certain they had been discovered and were preparing for a confrontation in the confined space of the cave. But then the creature moved on, apparently satisfied that this particular passage was empty. They waited several more minutes before daring to move, and even then, they progressed with extreme caution toward the entrance. The injured hiker, despite his pain, showed remarkable self-control in remaining silent during this crucial phase of their escape. When they finally reached the cave entrance, the creature was nowhere to be seen, but they could hear it somewhere in the depths of the cave system, still searching. The other trackers quickly helped carry the injured hiker away from the cave and toward the helicopter, moving as quickly as the terrain would allow while trying to minimize noise that might alert their pursuer. But they hadn't gone more than 100 yards before they heard the creature behind them. It had discovered their deception and was pursuing them through the forest. The sounds of its approach were terrifying, crashing through the underbrush, roaring in what sounded like rage and betrayal and gaining ground despite their head start. The creature's pursuit was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It wasn't just chasing them, it was hunting them with intelligence and strategy. Instead of following their exact path, it took parallel routes through the forest that would allow it to cut them off before they reached the helicopter. They could hear it moving through the trees on both sides of their escape route, sometimes ahead of them, sometimes behind, but always getting closer. Several times during the pursuit, they caught glimpses of the massive form moving through the forest with impossible speed and agility. Despite its enormous size, it moved through the undergrowth like a shadow, barely disturbing the vegetation as it maneuvered to intercept them. The contrast between its bulk and its grace was terrifying and mesmerizing. The creature's vocalizations during the chase were complex and varied, ranging from roars of anger to what sounded almost like calls of distress. Sometimes it seemed to be trying to communicate with them, making the same clicking and grunting sounds they had heard at the cave entrance. But now those sounds carried undertones of betrayal and loss that were unmistakably emotional. The race back to the helicopter was the longest half-mile any of them had ever experienced, carrying an injured man through difficult terrain while being pursued by an enraged creature pushed all of them beyond their physical limits. The pilot, despite his fear, proved invaluable in helping to clear obstacles and navigate the route back to their landing site. Using his knowledge of the terrain from their earlier aerial survey, they could hear the creature getting closer with each passing minute. It was faster in the forest than they were, unencumbered by an injured person, and far more familiar with the terrain. Its pursuit was relentless, but also seemed calculated. It appeared to be herding them toward the helicopter rather than trying to stop them entirely, as if it wanted them to leave its territory with their rescued companion. The final sprint across the meadow to the helicopter was pure terror mixed with desperate hope. The creature emerged from the tree line just as they reached the aircraft, roaring its fury at their escape. But rather than attacking, it stopped at the edge of the clearing and watched as they loaded the injured hiker into the helicopter. In those final moments before takeoff, all of them got their clearest look at the creature. Standing in full daylight at the edge of the meadow, it was even more impressive and terrifying than they had imagined. Its massive frame was perfectly proportioned with muscle definition visible even through its thick fur. But it was the creature's face that haunted them, showing not just anger but genuine sadness and loss, as if it understood exactly what was happening and why. The creature made no attempt to attack the helicopter or prevent their escape. Instead, it stood watching them with what could only be described as resignation, occasionally making the same vocalizations they had heard earlier, but now with a tone of mourning rather than communication. It was saying goodbye to the injured human it had been protecting, and its grief was unmistakable. The pilot had never started an aircraft so quickly in his life. The engine spun up in record time, and they were airborne within minutes of reaching the helicopter. As they lifted off, all of them looked back at the meadow where the creature still stood, watching their departure with what appeared to be sadness rather than anger. The flight to the nearest hospital took 40 minutes, during which the injured hiker remained conscious and coherent. He continued to insist that the creature had saved his life and had never shown any intention of harming him. Without its intervention, he would have died in the gorge where he had fallen. The medical team at the hospital confirmed that the hiker's injuries, while serious, were not life-threatening. His broken leg would require surgery and weeks of recovery, but he would make a full recovery. More importantly, his vital signs showed that he had been adequately hydrated and nourished during his captivity, supporting his claims about the creature's care. The official report filed with the search and rescue authorities mentioned the successful recovery of the missing hiker, but provided minimal details about the circumstances of his rescue. The three men agreed to keep the full story confidential, partly to protect the creature from potential hunters or researchers, and partly because they knew no one would believe them anyway. But the pilot couldn't stop thinking about what they had witnessed. The intelligence and apparent compassion shown by the creature challenged everything he thought he knew about wildlife. It had saved a human life, cared for an injured person for days, and had ultimately allowed them to take the hiker to safety without mounting a serious attack. In the weeks following the incident, the pilot found himself returning to the area during routine flights, looking for signs of the creature or its activities. He never saw it again, but he noticed that the cave entrance had been sealed with rocks and debris, as if the creature had abandoned its home after their intrusion. The two trackers also returned to the area several times, but they found no trace of the creature's continued presence. The bone pile had been scattered, the trail markers had been removed, and the forest showed no signs of the organized activity they had observed before. It was as if the creature had vanished completely. The injured hiker recovered fully from his ordeal and returned to hiking within 6 months. But he never again ventured into the remote areas of the forest where he had encountered the creature. He spoke occasionally about his experience to close friends, always emphasizing the creature's gentle treatment and apparent intelligence. The 3 men who participated in the rescue developed a bond that went beyond their shared experience. They met regularly to discuss what they had witnessed and to debate the implications of the creature's behavior. None of them had ever encountered anything in their previous wilderness experience that prepared them for what they had seen. The pilot eventually retired from search and rescue work, citing the physical and emotional demands of the job. But those who knew him well suspected that his decision was influenced by the knowledge that he might someday encounter something similar again, and he wasn't sure he had the courage to face it. The trackers continued their activities in the forest, but avoided the area around the cliff where they had found the creature. They occasionally heard stories from other outdoorsmen about strange sounds or unusual signs in the wilderness, but they never found evidence of the creature's continued presence in the region. The incident raised questions that none of them could answer satisfactorily. Was the creature unique, or were there others like it living in remote areas of the forest? Had it learned its behavior toward humans through previous contact, or was compassion a natural part of its character? Most importantly, had they done the right thing by taking the hiker away from a creature that was trying to help him? The injured hiker's recovery was complete, and he was grateful to be reunited with his family. But he often wondered about the fate of the creature that had saved his life. He hoped it had found a new home somewhere safe from human interference where its intelligence and apparent kindness wouldn't be seen as a threat. The helicopter pilot kept the footage he had captured during the initial search, but he never shared it with anyone outside the small group involved in the rescue. The images were clear enough to prove the creature's existence, but were too precious and potentially dangerous to release to the general public. Years later, all 3 men continued to be affected by their experience. They had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of the natural world and forced them to reconsider assumptions about intelligence, compassion, and the relationship between humans and wildlife. The forest where the incident occurred remains wild and largely unexplored. Hikers and hunters still venture into its remote areas, usually without incident, but occasionally, someone reports unusual sounds or signs that suggest they are not alone in the wilderness. Whether the creature they encountered was unique or part of a larger population remains unknown, but for 3 men who witnessed its intelligence and compassion firsthand, the experience proved that the natural world still holds mysteries that science has yet to explain or understand. The missing hiker they rescued has never forgotten the creature that saved his life. Despite the fear and confusion of his captivity, he remains convinced that he encountered a being of remarkable intelligence and unexpected kindness. His story serves as a reminder that not all monsters are what they appear to be, and that sometimes the most frightening encounters can reveal the most profound truths about the world around us.